The Artificer is a bit of a strange class, really. First introduced in a supplement for 3rd edition, it is rather popular and we're all very sad to see it go in 1D&D, but it does come across as a nerd's fantasy dream.
What if, instead of magic being cool and chaotic, it was more like a science that was understood?
Yeah, that's how the Artificer sees things, and means that while a wizard, sorcerer, and warlock are all just claiming they summon flames and demons from thin air, the Artificer is setting up the 59th doohickey that they have in their back pocket so that he can explain how their custom sprinkler actually covers everyone in glitter, creating the same effect as the fairy fire spell. The Artificer is just weird like that, but if you're up for flavour and versatility like no other, then it might be the class for you. It's not a simple class by any means, and unless you're a somewhat experienced player, love reading, or have a hard-on for steampunk, you might not get the most out of this class compared to any of your other options. But if you are ready to get tinkering, here are my top 5 tips for playing Artificer in D&D. Tip number 1. You always have the right tools. The Artificer can be a lot of different things, especially when you pick a specialization, as we'll get into later, but something that it revolves around no matter what kind of Artificer you make is tools. Tools in D&D, unless you're running a specific campaign which require you to use them a lot, are never really the most important things in a game. You can probably count on one hand the amount of times you've used a tool set that wasn't Thieves' Tools or Artisan's Tools if you've played an Artificer before. However, because of the right tools for the job, which lets you make your own tools, and because of tool expertise later on, you'll have a reason to start brewing your own beer with brewer's tools to impress the local tavern owner, or make a little wooden duck to hand to an NPC as a parting gift with your carpenter's tools. Imagine yourself as the ultimate handyman. You show up with a heaving bag of tools ready to take on whatever role the DM throws at you. This tip goes beyond just talking about the actual toolkits you get to make though. While these are important, and you can even flavour your magic artisan's tools like a wizard spellbook because of how vital they are to everything you do, an artificer's toolset also extends beyond their actual in-game tools. With their infusions, which we'll get into on a later point as well, you have access to magic items right from 2nd level, and while the ones you get in this early stage of the game aren't going to be legendary or artifact level, they give a great boost and can give rare bonuses to AC and spell attack/saves, or just grant you some interesting extra abilities like having a homunculus friend or a crossbow that repeats its shots. You've also got your magical tinkering from level 1, which essentially acts as the Artificer's own prestidigitation and can be incredibly useful in specific circumstances. You've always got to be on your toes with an Artificer because they have so much variety right from the early levels, and it can make them a powerhouse in a bunch of different roles, from defender to support to ranged damage dealer. With Flash of Genius later on, you'll even have a tool to save you and your allies in checks and saving throws, which, like we went over in the Paladin video, is never something to be ignored. This is all stuff you'll get within your first 7 levels too, with things like spell storing items and more magic item attunement slots coming in later as well. If that makes your head spin, you can still stick with some bread and butter stuff with an Artificer, but you should pay attention to all the things you can do. Tip number 2, know your specialization before you pick it. The Artificer subclasses really do define the way you'll play. Yes, you can take Cure Wounds and do some healing as an Artillerist, for example, but unless you prefer healing with bullets, you're going to want to play as an Alchemist if you want to be more of a healer and support, an Artillerist to blast foes from afar, and an Armourer or Battlesmith if you want to head into the fore of the fight, although I don't always recommend that considering an Artificer is a D8 class to start with. Even though you'll step into these subclasses at level 3, I think it's worth knowing what kind of Artificer you want to be long before that, especially if you're starting at level 1, for both your character's overall vibe and the gameplay mechanics. Starting with gameplay, you'll feel more prepared for your specialization if you've been able to infuse items and prep your build around it. For example, if you want to be an armourer, you're likely going to want enhanced armour as an infusion. If you're happy to stay far away from the fight and just want to be a supporter, then maybe a homunculus servant is more up your alley. With the Artificer's versatility, it can be easy to feel overwhelmed, but if you have your specialization in mind, you know what you'll be doing and focusing on more easily. This applies to your spell list too. If you don't really like picking a brand new list of spells each day, just prepare some that you know your character would always use. Like an Artillerist is going to want anything that blasts and creates a boom, while an Alchemist is more looking to buff and heal but can still get some damage in. Regarding how this affects your character, it should allow you to flavour them more easily. We'll get into specific flavouring in another tip, but if you know you're going down the path of an Alchemist, you're not going to start saying your magic is channeled through a robotic dog that follows you everywhere. And if you go down the path of an Armourer, you're not going to keep a potion kit around all the time as your main spellcasting method. Tip number 3, don't just rely on being a spellcaster. As an Artificer, you are what some players like to call a 2/3 caster. You don't get all the spells that a regular caster would get, but because you get spellcasting from level 1 and you get your cantrips, you're a bit more of a caster than, say, a ranger or a paladin. Also, you'll have more useful spells than those two classes usually, even if you don't have the levels needed to spam them, which is why, for this third tip, I ask you to treat the Artificer once more like its own weird little thing. It doesn't have the Paladin's smites nor the Ranger's Hunter's Mark, so it might come across as though you should just primarily be using your spells, but an Artificer's spell pool is a limited resource, and so you shouldn't just rely on it to solve all of your problems. The class is about magic, but in all of its forms. It's why you get so many magic item attunement slots, and even ways to create them. It's why your specialization often feels more of a bread and butter than anything else in your class, and it's why you've got so many options just in general. Both in and outside of combat, yes, spells can offer some great solutions. Don't save up that fireball as an artillerist if you spot 7 goblins, just begging to be blown into the goblin afterlife, but as such a smarty pants class, you should always be coming up with some clever artificer-like ways to solve your problems. Need to get a message out? Well, use that magical tinkering and bash some script into a nearby rock. Want to have a way to deal consistent damage every round? Become an artillerist or battlesmith. The Artificer, like I said, it has one hell of a toolkit, but unlike the Bard, where that versatility can be found entirely in your spell list or the way you RP, using your endless amount of charm, the Artificer just has a lot, and I mean a lot, of different things to do. Tip number 4. A Tuna Fish. No, you didn't just have a stroke. That's right, I said a tuna fish, something that the players at my home game have become accustomed to saying whenever they have to juggle their measly 3 attunement slots. Woe is me, I could only have armour, a weapon, and a funny ring. How will I ever go on? As an Artificer, you don't have to worry a single thing about that, as by leveling up and sticking with your Artificer throughout a campaign, you'll be able to attune yourself to up to 6 magic item slots. This leads on to what is, in my opinion, one of the best level 20 abilities in the game in Soul of Artifice. This grants you a +1 to saving throws for each magic item you're attuned to, and by this point you'll have +6 to all saving throws. Also, if you get knocked to 0 HP, you just get to unattune from an item and come back to 1 HP. With the armor buffs you'll likely have at this point in the game too, you're practically unkillable in combat. As someone who's played against this as a DM, trust me when I say it is a lot better in game than how it sounds on paper, as even though a level 20 Artificer might not do as much damage as something like a level 20 Wizard, only one of them is winning that war of attrition. You can have better saving throws than bosses at that point, and so of course it's worth attuning to your items. But as very few campaigns get to level 20, you might think this tip is a bit useless. However, it's still worth keeping those slots maxed out, even when you've only got the 3, purely so you know you're rocking with the best gear you can have. If you don't really care for anything else an Artificer has to offer, and you only want to focus on one mechanic, I would recommend your infusions first and foremost. Not only do they mean you don't have to be greedy with magic items to max out your attunement slots, as you can just make more yourself, but these infusions also allow you to have even more magic items that your attunement slots can allow, as not all of them need that attunement focus. Of course, infusions have their own limitations based on the amount you can make per level, but if you've already got some attunement gear because your DM is a lovely guy, don't think this mechanic is suddenly useless to you. Not to mention, you can also grab yourself a whole heap of magic items already in the game, including the necessary bag of holding. That means even if your DM is a stickler for magic items, you can just make what's needed. Just be sure to keep an eye on your attunements and infusions, making sure you don't go overboard on either, and you'll slowly but surely prove the Artificer's worth. Tip number 5. Add a little bit of spice. My last 4 tips have been mostly about gameplay and how you want to play the Artificer, but for this final tip I'd like to talk about my personal favourite thing to do with a tinkering Toby, as I like to call it, which is add plenty of flavour. Artificers are arguably the most fit class in the game to flavour the way you want, as you're playing a character who interprets magic in an entirely different way to most people in the world. You're likely going to have your own way of understanding what ways in which your character casts spells and creates magical effects. I'll give you an example of what I mean through my own Artificer, who I made when I'd just finished Red Dead Redemption 2, and so I had a bit of a cowboy thing going on, if you get my drift. The idea was simple. He was an artillerist who had a hand cannon as his summonable cannon and a revolver which he used as his day-to-day spellcasting tool. A cantrip like Firebolt would be a single shot from the revolver, while Scorching Ray would be fanning the hammer. I would also think of different gadgets and how they could create the same effects as spells, such as using a grenade for fireball, some sticky thread for web, and a line of funnels that shot air out for gust of wind and wind wall. Not everything necessarily had to have its own bullet or gadget form, as sometimes you won't have the time or motivation to describe every spell and how it's cast, but if you want to get into the mindset of what an Artificer is like, I don't think there's anything better than adding this flavour. While of course you can add flavour to other classes in the way you do your thing, like having your wizard spellbook actually be tattoos bound to their skin, or having your hexblade take on a different personality whenever they have to draw their sword, the Artificer relies on this flavouring as a core concept in the class. It makes it weird by default and a class that some DMs just don't run, as it can break their world by being too focused on technology, but this is a great opportunity to let your creative juices flow. Actually, don't do that. Keep your juices inside you, but do get creative with things. And that wraps up today's talk on the Artificer. Are you ready to get rid of that dusty tome and use the ever-impressive power of gun for your spells? I'm going to assume you said yes, in which case good. Like and subscribe for more tips and guides, and let me know what your top Artificer tip is, as well as any other classes you'd like me to cover in the future. See you soon, ghouls and gals.